Yeah, thank you, Megan. I guess we don't have to move to Norway after all. We got better weather, we know that. Well, thank you. Continuing on our theme of long-term competitiveness for South Carolina, our next speaker, Anne-Marie Stieritz, serves as president and CEO of the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness. Prior to that, she served as deputy executive director of the University of South Carolina's Office of Economic Engagement. Anne-Marie earned her BA from Xavier University and has a degree from the Sorbonne in Paris, as well as master's degrees from NYU, one of my alma maters as well. So please join me in welcoming Anne-Marie Stieritz. Thank you.
I've been asked to step out here for a minute while I get all set up, so thank you. And as with the other speakers, Dean Bruce, Doug, Joey, thank you so much for including us. We have a long-standing relationship with the Moore School and with Doug and Joey in particular, so we're especially grateful to have a chance to talk with you today. And I've approached this very much knowing that I was the final speaker on the agenda and might have the opportunity perhaps to try to place some of this in context. We certainly got a fantastic overview of our national perspective, so looking forward for some of that. Megan, of course, with a regional perspective, and Joey with our kind of snapshot of South Carolina. So what I hope to do is perhaps encapsulate some of this, talk about not only the work that we do, but the kinds of questions perhaps that we can ask going forward. And because I've had the benefit, of course, of hearing some of the questions in the audience, I know I'll be able to touch on some of that infrastructure, skills issues, things like that, to talk a little bit about what we're aware is going on in the state, but we also have some areas of focus that we would suggest as well. And let me tell you, first of all, who we are. We are the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness, and in a nutshell, we were established in 2004 when a group of the private sector leadership in the state at that time said, we've got a lot of advantages going on in South Carolina. We had landed BMW, we saw great assets with the port, however, we're pursuing a low-cost strategy in terms of economic development, and we need a strategy for the state. So there was at that time a convening of policymakers, the heads of our academic research institutions, as well as our technical college system, and our private sector leadership. Worked with Harvard University with Dr. Michael Porter, looked at laying out a competitiveness strategy for South Carolina that was long-term in focus. And out of that came the South Carolina Council on Competitiveness as kind of a convening entity and someone to guide the ship and keep the eye on the mission for that. So our mission in terms of focusing on long-term economic competitiveness for the state has remained the same. Now, how do we go about doing this work? We describe our work as fitting in three areas. We do actionable research, emphasis on actionable. We undertake research examinations with the eye of there's going to be some kind of action taken following the analysis that we do. We do focus specifically on industry clusters in the state, and I'll talk about why we do that, as well as education and workforce. We certainly have other focus areas that we're asked to the table to do, but in general, that's kind of the bulk of day-to-day work that we do. And when we talk about competitiveness, let me tell you how I'm framing this up for the purposes of these conversations, particularly when we're talking about a long-term perspective. There's a lot of definitions out there about what is competitiveness. This is looked at globally, it's looked at on the regional level, it's looked at nationally. All of these, though, tend to usually contain something in the definition dealing with productivity. And we heard that kind of come up, I think, in some of the conversation today. And part of that because that can be a main factor in driving growth in income levels. Now, rising competitiveness should be about rising prosperity, rising economic prosperity. And by definition with that, we mean having a high and rising standard of living for the citizens. So when we're talking about long-term, that's the context in which we're viewing this. Typically, productivity measured by GDP per capita, and just in case you can't see this, let me just explain this graph. The top is the United States GDP per capita mapped from 2000 to 2014. The red line at the bottom, that's South Carolina's GDP per capita. And the green line in the middle is our South Carolina's GDP per capita as a percentage of the U.S. We trend lower. We know this. This has been going on for a while. Some of that, there's always factors in that denominator in terms of population growth that drive that as well. But in general, when you're looking at productivity, we know that we are below the national average. The other data point I wanted to put in here as context is our wage growth and where we fit in as a percentage of U.S. wages. Joey alluded to this. Again, the blue line is the United States wage growth rate over this period of time, about 3.3% per year. South Carolina, we're at about 3.1% per year. But if you look at our average South Carolina wage as a percent of the U.S. average, you can see that's that green trend line. We've been pretty flat, actually, in terms of that. But I do think some of the trends Joey's talking about is going to be interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about what that might be. The next slide that we looked at, again, to go to GDP, this is per worker. So not just per capita, but per worker. So looking at this again, just to set some context, you can see, again, our trend line tends to be lower than that. So just in terms of what are some of these macro level data points that we usually look at? And we see this really declining over time. But how do we kind of reconcile this with all the good news that we hear going on? And Joey talked about advanced manufacturing. We continue to see growth there. We're anticipating that we also will. Our Department of Commerce's recruitment strategy. We've made South Carolina a global name when it comes to recruiting companies into South Carolina. And by their data, in 2015 alone, they claim $4 billion in capital investment, 150 projects landed in South Carolina, and over 17,000 jobs recruited. And that's just in 2015. Those are the Department of Commerce's numbers. They claim we rank first in the nation. This is actually validated by some other studies, that we do rank first in the nation in creating jobs from the opening of new businesses that are headquartered somewhere else. So we do rank number one. So think about this, but this is, if you think about kind of the mix of what we have in our recruitment strategy, we have been successful at the strategy that we have pursued. We rank 15th in exports overall. We talked about some of that. Ranked as the top exporter of passenger motor vehicles. We know that. We know the tire data. So we hear these things. So this does represent success in terms of our economic development strategy. This is what we've deliberately pursued. So the question then becomes, we hit on some of this, I think, are we vulnerable, given that this is the strategy we've pursued? In terms of automation, what could that mean? In terms of it's a positive thing that we're very globally connected because of foreign direct investment, because of our export emphasis, but especially now in this uncertain environment, are we going to have vulnerabilities if there's differences in trade policies or others that are going to affect our companies and the types of companies in our state? So really the question that we would propose, again, taking a longer term perspective on this is, how do we take this economic development success and leverage that to build economic prosperity and make sure that we're growing? So we have posed a few different questions. Again, we have been highly successful at recruitment. So I want to leave you with some good things going on in South Carolina, as well as posing some of these questions in some areas where perhaps we need to be looking more intently. And that is, we've done a very good job recruiting. Again, primarily around manufacturing, but not exclusively, and I'll talk to you about that as well. But one of the partnerships that we've developed with the Department of Commerce has said we've done a good job recruiting individual companies. But the part that needs to be in the mix, and this is where the importance of industry clusters comes in, is how do we move beyond transactions with individual companies to building an ecosystem that supports this? Advanced manufacturing is important, largely because of the multiplier effects in the supply chains that can represent to us. So the longer term perspective that we have taken in partnership with the Department of Commerce has been looking specifically at aerospace. These are not the only ones, but they're the ones that I can speak most directly to. Aerospace, and most recently, South Carolina logistics. We've done a lot of the aerospace research, both with Doug and Joey, as they referenced earlier. And the work around developing that industry cluster is bringing private sector companies together to find collaborative opportunities, to find opportunities for innovation, to look at what they need in the talent pool and say, this isn't about recruiting one company. This is about connecting all of our aerospace-related companies in the state to understand and also to hear from them what is going on in the ecosystem. We've had tremendous success around aerospace, and because of that, we've also partnered now at a look at logistics. Largely, again, you'll see because of the advanced manufacturing focus. So when we're saying logistics, we're talking about logistics users as well as logistics providers. We're doing data analysis with Joey right now about identifying who are these companies in the state, who are the providers, but also the users. There was a question earlier about some of the pain points of some of our manufacturers in moving freight. Part of our conversations have been, how do we talk with these companies, understand where that is? As we're having these infrastructure questions in South Carolina, how do we identify these freight corridors and understand where are the log jams in terms of our commerce, in terms of economic commerce and moving goods to market? I also do want to point out that we've been fortunate enough to receive some federal assistance with both of these from the Economic Development Administration, so we've been happy to have their support as well. So as we think about this strategy and how do we continue this, we've had great success under this administration, but that's good. Those are the transactions. How do we position South Carolina to have longer-term success and sustained success? And we believe it's through looking at these clusters. There are others, of course. Automotive is one, which certainly is very recognizable, as well as we're looking at life sciences, SC Bio. Agribusiness is significant as well in the state. So how do we move beyond just the one-off recruitments? The other question, again, in this short amount of time, is our economy diversified? When we say this, we certainly know our manufacturing strength because it's what we hear most about. I will say, in terms of the Department of Commerce statistics, they talk about 44% of the jobs in 2015 recruited, including warehouse and distribution operations, and also that 5 of the top 10 announcements that our Department of Commerce announced in 2015 were in the service sector, if you look at them by number of jobs. But what we would also propose is that it's not just about industry sectors, it's also about types of companies. And this is where we need to have some conversations about innovation, entrepreneurship, and what that ecosystem also looks like in our state. Again, we've done a very good job with recruiting those companies out. How are we growing companies that are here? But not only growing them, are we able to retain them as they get to growth stage? We've made a lot of progress. Again, I want to talk about the positive things that we're doing in South Carolina in this area. We've seen the involvement, I'd say in the past 5 years, of a number of angel groups, both funds as well as networks. We saw for the first time the establishment of an Office of Innovation within our Department of Commerce, focusing on understanding what this looks like. We've seen the spread of different kinds of incubation programs across the state in different geographic areas. The South Carolina Research Authority, of course, a sponsor today, has made significant investments through its SC Launch program in startup companies and is really recalibrating the relationship with our research universities that are going to be so important because it's not just about producing patents. It's not just about accumulating knowledge, but it's can we translate them into commercial value? And that's where the economic impact and the economic value comes from. And it just hasn't traditionally been one of the focus areas for us. But when we say innovation, also want to say this doesn't just mean technology-based companies. I think our definition of innovation as we think about this, particularly given our industry mix in South Carolina, has to be what enables all companies, including the service sector, to basically be more flexible, to be more innovative, and to be able to adapt to change. So technical and non-technical innovations are important. And a particular focus that I would bring to your attention that's been a focus of ours, again, we did work with Doug and Joey on this, is high growth businesses. And these are these companies that are interested in scaling, that are a little past the startup mode, but are seeing high growth in employment and in revenue. in sales. So our recent data, we undertook this research with Joey's assistance. It isn't something that we put out publicly, mainly because we felt our data was lagging a little too much. This is up to 2013 data. But you can see their annual employment growth in the current economic expansion, and by that, that was 2009 to 2013, a 4-year period, was lower than during the previous one, which really was a 1992, to 2007. So we saw that, and that decline really seems to be largely driven by the decline in the growth rates of small firms. So fewer than 500 employees by the definition of the Small Business Association. But there are some companies that have been able to achieve high net job growth rates and revenue rates, and these are what we call these high growth firms. And our research showed that these firms, about 1.5% of all the companies in South Carolina during this 4-year period, created about 75.9% of net employment gains. So who are these companies? Can we keep them? What's going on? How do we keep them here? And again, this is past a startup phase. This is when we're really getting to scalability. And that's been the challenge for us. We've made the things that I described before in terms of where we've made progress. A lot of that is about seeding the companies, the front end of the company establishment process. But when they get into the growth phase, we haven't really had tools in place. We haven't had incentives in place. We haven't necessarily had direct service provision to know how to identify and how to assist these companies. So we think this is a gap, and this is something when we're talking about diversifying our economy, this is what we mean. The other thing to understand, as I said before, is this doesn't necessarily mean when we think of these firms, they're typically thought of as who's the next Facebook. That's one way to think of it, but these aren't necessarily all a commercialization of a particular product. They don't necessarily have to be technology companies, but they are technology enabled. And when we looked at what are the industries in which in South Carolina we were seeing most of these high growth firms, they were in those professional, scientific, and technical services, administrative and support services, some around building and general contracting. So not necessarily exclusively taking invention commercialization, although there is technology engaged in them. So this is a conversation that we haven't necessarily had in a big way, but we think this is a very important area of focus within the state. And the other thing that I would mention here is the other shift that this will have to undertake in having this conversation is this also requires different measures. This isn't necessarily about high levels of capital investment. It is about high wages, and it is about high growth in employment and value of the company. So we're used to looking for high job numbers and high capital investment numbers. And that's important, and we want it. It's not to say we don't. These aren't mutually exclusive things. But we also need to think about, and this is hard from a policymaking perspective and how traditional economic developers are incented, that our measures are different. Are we creating value? Are we creating wealth? Are we creating prosperity? So that will have to be part of that conversation. So in addition to the question I'd pose about, is our economy diversified? I'd say, is our prosperity broad-based? And I think part of this really came to mind for me, I think, as simply because of a lot of the conversations that we're seeing post-election. I wasn't quite sure where our keynote was going to go today, but I think there is this question of where did we see geographic prosperities here? Where are we seeing productivity gains? Where are we seeing high output? How is that then playing out within our broader systems, and what does that mean? So not only on the case of just being a good thing, but there are implications for, is your prosperity broad-based? So I wanted to point out, I cut Megan's picture out here in terms of some of the conversations that are going on regionally, because in a lot of ways, some of these conversations do happen very regionally in terms of quality of life issues, other types of things that at the state level are kind of difficult to get at because it's very community-based. But I did want to point out, of course, Ingenuity SC takes a look at this on an annual basis. I also wanted to let you know about a couple other areas of the state, in case you have an interest in this. The Charleston region, one region is Charleston, Dorchester, Berkeley counties, has just undertaken a very intensive community-wide assessment and coming up with a similar plan that they're using for their scorecard. But a very deep data dive. This is all published out there. And wanted to let you know it's not quite the same way, but because I'm talking about broad-based prosperity here, the South Carolina Promise Zone is made up of 6 of the counties in the I-95 corridor that received this Promise Zone designation from the Obama administration that essentially allows them to be classified in special categories when they're pursuing federal opportunities and get priority rankings. They were I think they were only the second rural area in the nation to actually receive this designation. So what that enabled, though, was community-based conversations about what do we want to see happen in our community. So in knowing Megan was going to speak here, I wanted to also talk about, if you're interested in looking at these regions, there are others going on. The Promise Zone's a little less data-intensive, but it is a question of what's rising to the top in terms of what these communities feel they need or hope for themselves. The other reason I wanted to highlight this is because I think we really have to commend the regions that undertake this process, because when I was talking again about this difference between, I think, economic development and are we driving economic prosperity, our tendency in practicing economic development is we don't want to put the negative data out there, right? Because it's a marketing tool in terms of when we're recruiting companies. So I think for communities that choose to really do this self-assessment and be willing to put the information out there as a way to benchmark and say, here's what we're doing, as long as Megan said, they're willing to take the action and to do something about that, I think that's a very healthy process, and I think it's important. And we certainly talk about doing that at the state level. We're intending to do it around innovation, specifically looking at the state and where we stack up with that. But it can be a difficult thing to put out there because it is a bit of a vulnerability, because you're not always going to look good. So I did want to point that out. But when we're talking about broad-based, and I know you're not going to be able to read all of this, so let me just tell you what this is. This is personal income by county as a percentage of the state total. And I put full credit here. I stole this from Frank Rainwater. He and I co-presented, and I thought this was a very powerful slide. Frank Rainwater with the Department of Revenue and Fiscal Affairs is now called, so former Budget and Control Board. And graphically, I wanted you to see what this looks like. But let me tell you, the counties on the left, so this is personal income. This is not just wage income. This is personal income, so all income coming in. On the left, which is where you see the highest level bars, and these are ranked by 2014 data, are Greenville, Charleston, Richland, Lexington, Spartanburg, Horry, York. Those are the ones right over on the far left. They're showing the highest bar there. The counties on the right, Barnwell, Hampton, Calhoun, Lee, Bamberg, McCormick, Allendale. So I think what's so compelling about this is just looking at the skewed nature of this graph in terms of where we're seeing that coming from. Now, the other statement that's important to understand, and if Frank were here, he'd do this, but I didn't want to give his presentation, is that the other thing that we're seeing happen in South Carolina, the reason I really pointed out that this is personal income and not just wage income, is we're seeing a shift in the percentage of personal income that's wage versus government transfer. We're seeing a higher percentage, according to Frank's data, of government transfer programs making up personal income. Some of that's our demographics. We have an aging population, so a lot of these things that our keynote speaker was talking about earlier, we're seeing play out in this, as well as population shifts. We're losing population in our rural counties, as the leaders there will know. So this really builds questions, as Megan's showing data for the Columbia MSA, and we're seeing Kershaw, and we're seeing Fairfield in there that are more challenged. What is that doing to the numbers? And do we need to connect those communities to the larger centers where our economic growth is actually occurring? Let me also tell you, just as a sidebar before I lose this slide, I gave you the absolute numbers. Let me tell you which counties have had the biggest change, or let me say the largest gain in percentages. So there's 2 bars there, and this is between 2000 and 2014. So who had the largest gains in terms of percentage of personal income compared to the state? Charleston, Berkeley, York, Dorchester, Horry, Beaufort, Lancaster. So I think in terms of some of the data that Joey's shown us about the growth, I think intuitively what we're understanding about growth in the Charleston region, the challenges, Charleston's facing a very interesting challenge. We've never had in this, a region of the state see this kind of growth. So this is a fantastic opportunity, but we really don't have a model in South Carolina of how you do this and how you manage it. So that's a big part of their conversation. So I want to point out when we're talking about, is our prosperity broad-based? And this does have implications. Another thing that I want to point out that I think is important in this conversation is broadband. We were talking about infrastructure earlier. We're focusing on the roads. We're talking about logistics. We're having these conversations. We want to understand what the economic impact of that is. I would really argue, given when we're talking about infrastructure, we've got to be talking about digital infrastructure. Given all the shifts that we're seeing in the economy, when we're talking a long-term focus, what are jobs going to be? You're going to have to be technology enabled. Does our population have access? This is statistics on just broadband deployment. So this is just the percentage of the population with broadband availability. So you see at the top, the United States, we're a little lower in terms of than the percentage, national percentage. But also, again, here's our counties. Far right, Greenville, Richland, Spartanburg, Charleston. Far left, and again, this is just a sampling. Obviously, not all the counties are up here. Kershaw, Williamsburg, Orangeburg. So we're seeing the disparity in terms of, this is just broadband availability. But the other piece is, it's not just about is broadband available, are people using it? So this is a chart showing how many households actually have a subscription to broadband. So who's using it? The yellow bars at the top, again, I'm not to read the chart to you, but I know it may not be easy to see from the back. The U.S. Percentage, again, percentage of households, is the yellow bar at the top. The blue bar is all of South Carolina, percentage of households with broadband subscription, not just access. The red is Metro South Carolina, all of Metro South Carolina. The green is non-Metro South Carolina. So this is 2013, 2014, 2015. So again, we're seeing this difference between this availability. Why does this matter? It's going to matter for our manufacturing facilities as we move more toward automated facilities, and what is the capacity and needs going to be for our manufacturers. It matters for employment. How many paper job applications are you aware of now? I need to be able to access opportunities to be able to have access to the employment market. What about our students in schools in some of these areas who need to be skilled and with digital skills? It's one thing to put laptops in the school. If I take it home and I have no access, can I continue and am I at a disadvantage? So this has implications. There is discussion about whether this could also spur entrepreneurship, whether broadband access and adoption spurs entrepreneurship and e-commerce, because of the idea that I could set that up from anywhere. I will say the data, we haven't done our own analysis of that. It seemed the correlation seems a little shaky. There doesn't seem to be a direct correlation, or certainly not causality there, enough that can be shown. But this access to markets coming through digital infrastructure, I think, is a conversation as we're having that. That's one that's important to have. It's happening in pockets. Whenever I bring this up, people say, absolutely, this is so important. But we haven't really catalyzed action around that. So I think that's, in thinking about broad-based prosperity over the long term, access is important. And then finally, as no surprise, given the conversations we've had in this room, is our future talent prepared to succeed? Again, a lot of good things going on in the states and in South Carolina, and a lot of good action taking place in conversations, because this is such a pain point. It really is, in terms of what we're hearing, that skills gap. We're hearing that. We have, for the first time, formed last year, the General Assembly created a coordinating council for workforce development. That's chaired by the Secretary of Commerce and brings together at the state level all of the agencies that have funding or pieces of workforce development to get them to collaborate and try to figure out, you know, what is it that we even have here if we map all this out? How How do we do this more efficiently? When we do that recruitment process, we have Ready SC, which is a nationally recognized training program to make sure that companies that locate here have a skilled workforce on day one. The Manufacturers Alliance has an initiative to promote future makers, South Carolina future makers, to promote the manufacturing industry and talent and development in that. We have a great apprenticeship program. These are addressing our immediate pain points. When we're thinking longer term and we're talking about a talent pipeline, we need to start all the way back at the beginning, though, when we're talking long term. That's not to say the others aren't important. These are real demands right now. And we're looking at I love the skills gap misery index. I had never seen that actually presented that way. So what does that mean? Labor market's tightening. I have to be more competitive as an individual in order to compete for those jobs now. In a tight labor market, there's more competitive there. We also know the Lumina Foundation has said that 60% of students will need post-secondary credentials at a national level, but only 40% currently have them in South Carolina. So we're increasing in that. That's going up. But again, we're not there in terms of what we need to do. And this is a global question. We need to have a global orientation. And I think we've captured some of this today. Because change occurs so quickly, there's a high level of uncertainty regarding the skills needed for the future. This is from the Global Competitiveness Index that's put up by the World Economic Forum. However, at all skill levels, individuals are going to be rewarded for the capacity to think critically, solve problems, take advantage of new technology. Schools are going to need to teach flexible thinking, showing students how to cooperate, working with individuals of different backgrounds, and nurture the ability to challenge, confront, and critically appraise differing ideas. It's pretty difficult, I think, for any of us to sit in this room right now and tell a middle school student that we know what the jobs are going to look like by the time that student's entering the job market. What we do know is that these skills that are globally applicable and that this is a global conversation, these are going to be fundamental no matter what an individual moves into. So how do we do this? We even see this, we call these soft skills foundational skills. There's a lot of terminology, we'll use soft skills. We know that 9 out of 10 executives in national surveys say that soft skills are as important as the technical skills an employee brings to the job, but only half of them rate their employees as being adequate in this area. So this is softer stuff, but we know this in a global capacity. We don't know what that landscape's going to look at. There is good news in South Carolina in this regard in terms of the conversation that we're having. And that is, last year, the South Carolina legislature adopted the profile of the South Carolina graduate. Full disclosure, we house the initiative that this fits under called Transform SC, so I'll let you know this. But the reason I wanted to put this up is because what I think is significant about this is this was developed, this is education. It took 18 months to get to this one piece of paper in working with superintendents and working with educators, State Chamber of Commerce. It's now been adopted by the School Boards Association, by the Arts Association, by us, the Commission on Higher Education, saying we at least now have agreement on what a South Carolina graduate needs to look like in terms of being prepared for a 21st century economy. Here's why I want to point it out in the context of what I was talking about now. World-class knowledge is on the far left. This is all the rigorous standards that we typically think of in terms of what students are going to need to be successful for college and career. But I want you to look here. World-class skills and life and career characteristics. Creativity and innovation, critical thinking and problem solving, collaboration and teamwork, et cetera, global perspective, perseverance, these things that 2/3 of what you're seeing here are actually non-cognitive, non-technical skills that any student, those are those global skills from the Global Competitiveness Index are outlined here. So why is this good? This is because this has now been recognized in South Carolina. We even have elementary schools now that are developing curriculum, and this said that any education policies that we put in place need to align with this profile, the South Carolina graduate. So we're not there, but we were having the right conversation and have been in terms of how we need to move this forward in South Carolina. So I've just left you with some questions. I wanted to leave you with some information on where are there good things going on in South Carolina, but also make some suggestions about, again, about are we pursuing a diversified strategy? Is our prosperity broad-based? And finally, this large question about talent and skills development, which I know was clearly front and center in terms of our conversations today. So you can certainly contact me if you want to talk about more of this. I know we're wrapping up and have some other good news, I think, to celebrate here at the end of the program. So it's such a pleasure to be with you. Feel free to reach out to us. Look at our website and look forward to having continuing conversations with you about how we move South Carolina's competitiveness forward for the long term. Thanks so very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Anne Marie.